Welcome to HDTV. You're now rocking with your boy. What drove the historically large murder spike in 2020? The pandemic, police violence, and more guns all contributed to an unprecedented rise in murders across the United States. Amid the pandemic, lockdown orders, and nationwide protests against police violence, a historically large increase in murders occurred in 2020. Previously, the largest recorded one-year rise in murders in U.S. history was a 12.7% increase in 1968. Last year, meanwhile, data from nearly 12,000 law enforcement agencies released by the FBI running through September shows murders up 21% nationally. This matches data we collected from a sample of agencies from 60 large cities showing a 36% increase in murders in those cities, as well as a Council on Criminal Justice analysis from 34 cities finding a 30% increase in 2020 compared to 2019. This increase still leaves the murder rate nearly 40% below the peak rate reached in the 1990s. Any explanation for the national spike in homicides in 2020 needs to account for why most U.S. cities saw an increase, and the available evidence suggests that we should avoid simplistic or local explanations to explain what we almost certainly a complex national phenomena. Murders were up in at least 15% through September in cities of every population group. According to the FBI's data, and the change in murders was larger in towns with under 10,000 people, up 31%, than in cities with over 1 million people, up 29%. Murders rose, sorry about that. Murders rose dramatically in big cities like New York and Chicago, but smaller cities like Lubbock, Texas, and Shreveport, Louisiana, also recorded their highest murder counts in decades. Identifying the change in the murder rate is relatively easy compared to figuring out why the increase occurred. The data suggests that 2020's murder increase can best be thought about as three separate rises. A deeper dive into where and when murder increased shows a number of contributing factors: a challenge to police legitimacy and the strain of the pandemic, exacerbated by a sudden surge in the use of firearms in several cities. It likely takes more than one factor to create a spike of this size. That means it wasn't just the pandemic or police violence or more guns. It was all of these things happening simultaneously and perhaps more. He said. Thomas ABT, Director of National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice and co-author of its report of 2020 crime trends. First, murder was up in the United States during the early spread of the novel coronavirus. Before lockdowns were even ordered, the FBI's report, which does not include data on big cities like Chicago and Philadelphia, found murder rates up 7% in its sample of cities through the first quarter of the year. We found murder was up through April relative to 2019 in 11 of 14 cities that published monthly murder data. Princeton University sociologist Patrick Sharkey found that fatal shootings had risen in 75% of the 99 largest cities through April. It's not fully clear what caused the murder rate to be higher early in 2020 compared to 2019. Though a variety of factors such as increased domestic violence early in the pandemic, warmer weather, or just plain randomness may have contributed. Violence accelerated throughout the summer in the second phase of 2020's murder increase in gun violence over the summer. Murder was up 15% through June in the FBI's data, and many cities saw sudden and dramatic upswings in July and August. Portland, Oregon, for example, averaged 9 shootings per month over the first 6 months of the year, but there were 35 and 36 in July and August, respectively. In Omaha, Nebraska, 32 people were non-fatally shot in July 2020 compared to 4 in July 2019. Shootings in New York City increased from 123 in July 2019 to 316 in July 2020, and 497 people were shot in Philadelphia in July and August 2020 compared to 276 over the same months of 2019. It is certainly possible that local factors played a role, but a change this sudden and widespread calls for a more comprehensive explanation. One theory for why gun violence increased over summer suggests that changes in policing tactics, both during and after last summer's protests, caused the rise. It is not clear, however, that a change in policing tactics was the main cause. In New York City, for example, looking at data for just 2020 suggests that a change in policing as a plausible explanation for the rise in gun violence, as arrests fell 39% in the summer relative to the first 3 months of 2020. A longer view, however, shows that arrests in New York have been dropping for over a decade, including a big drop in arrests in April 2020, with no clear impact on gun violence citywide. Similar sudden, large drops in drug and illegal weapons arrests, which are proxies for proactive policing, over the last decade have not previously been associated with large increases in gun violence in New York. And it's certainly possible that murder rose because police were dedicating more resources to responding to last year's protests. If this was the case, then it might make sense for murder to increase the most in places that had the most protests. But there wasn't any connection between the number of Black Lives Matter protests and the change in murder in big cities. According to an analysis of protests, data collected by the Armed Conflict Locations and Event Data Project, this analysis does not account for the scale or potential destructiveness of protests, but it does suggest that police deployment driven by the number of protests in a city is unlikely to be a major culprit for the rise in murder. Changes in how the public perceives the legitimacy of policing, caused in part by the highly publicized killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, may have driven violence up. Because of broken trust with community members, some members are less likely to rely on the police, provide information, and serve as witnesses, among other things, said ABT. Ultimately, that means fewer violent disputes being solved through the formal criminal justice system and more of them dealt with informally through retaliation, causing homicides and other violent crimes to increase. The third phase of increasing murder likely occurred in the fall. Murder was up 21% through September compared to being up 15% through June, suggesting that violence was continuing to get worse. The years-to-date change in murder was higher through October than through July in 9 of 14 cities with monthly murder data available. And an analysis from Boston University's research on innovations for safety and equity, or RISE, found a second increase in murder in October in a 34-city sample. New Orleans, for example, averaged about one shooting per day in March, almost two shootings per day in July, and around 2.5 shootings per day in October. Pandemic fatigue, alongside the worsening economic and psychological strain of life under lockdown, could have driven this third wave of violence. The coronavirus pandemic has concentrated in precisely the same communities where high rates of crime and violence concentrate. When people in these communities are placed under additional strain, they're more likely to make bad decisions, just like we all are. This pushes the risk of violence even higher, ABT said. Homicide was up 30% relative to 2019 according to RISE analysis, But gun homicides were up 39% relative to 2019 in their sample, highlighting the role of firearms in last year's historic murder increase. As the pandemic began, fearful citizens rushed out to buy firearms in record-breaking numbers. Sales spiked in the spring, and 2020 finished with more total background checks, a proxy for sales, than any year on record, 39% higher. Although newly purchased guns usually take years to reach use in crimes, according to Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives data from 2019, about 10% of all guns recovered by the ATF are used in the commission of a crime within 6 months after purchase, adding 19.2 million new guns from January to June, 5 million more sold than in the same time frame in 2019, equates to potentially many more weapons available for use in crimes in the remaining months of 2020. An influx of guns cannot directly cause an increase in murders. People must be willing to use them, but evidence suggests that after firearm sales increased, people started employing weapons in crimes more often than ever before. Where guns are important is in what happens as a consequence of an attack. The use of a gun as opposed to a knife or a club or other weapon intensifies the violence and makes it more lethal, said Philip Cook, a professor emeritus, emeritus of public policy at Duke University. The ratio of assaults with handguns to those without reached the highest level in at least 20 years of recorded Chicago data. Other cities show similar patterns. Los Angeles crime data showed offenders use guns more often in crimes than in any year since at least 2010. The earliest data was available. Louisville, Kentucky had a large jump in the share of murders committed with guns, and many cities experienced increases in gun seizures even while other kinds of arrests decline. So what you see is that as gun availability increases, a higher percentage of the crimes are committed with guns, and as a result, there are more deaths than there would be otherwise, Cook said. Because the FBI does not release full national data on crime for nearly 9 months after the year in question, the landscape of crime across the nation is still uncertain. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives also does not release the limited information it collects for months. Crucially, the ATF does not track the chain of custody from a gun's initial purchase through subsequent secondhand purchases or thefts into use in a crime, making it impossible to know exactly how surges in gun purchases translate into greater availability of firearms among those who use them to commit crimes. This information vacuum leaves the role of various factors like gun availability in driving murders, as well as the underlying causes of the increase in violence in these cities, murky and uncertain. Although some of the reasons behind the increase in murders are likely to abate in 2021, like the stress of the pandemic, others will have a longer term effect, like the surge in firearm sales and changing perceptions about police. It's possible that the complex stew of forces that drove murders higher in 2020 will continue to impact the homicide rate for years to come. So, better data collection and an improved understanding of the causes of 2020's murder rise is critical for implementing smart policies to reverse this trend. Yeah, so basically it's telling you the causes and the rises of crime, and mostly it's been due to the pandemic and of course violences in poor areas, and as well as police doing extra stuff, going overboard with arrest or going overboard with interrogation. That also raises the crime. But my thing is this: the areas that have a crime is mainly in the black neighborhoods where they put the weapons there. But nobody wants to talk about this. Everybody wants to keep turning a blind eye to that, but they're just saying, oh, black people stay there, so that's fine. But then when white people get killed, like this story I'm about to do, this guy, I think these kids blew up or did something terrible to a Holocaust thing. Everyone wants to make that national news and react because it's dealing with the pink folk and it's their problems. But when it comes to the poor, like the blacks or the Mexicans or the Spanish or any minority, it's not seen as a problem. It's seen as, oh, that's just what happens. So that's what they're trying to condition your mind to, is to see, well, the reason the murders are going up is because of the poor areas, then the pandemic and all that, and over policing. And then, of course, in the poor areas, you drop the weapons and the drugs there. So you're arresting people and people are killing each other for stuff that you put there. And that's the problem. They didn't go get these drugs from they got these drugs from somebody who dropped it there. There's been plenty of gangsters or old guys and who were thugs or OGs or they were mentors. They've seen this stuff happen in the hood where they've dropped weapons and they dropped drugs there. Like they've dropped containers there. And they're like, where did these containers come from? But nobody wants to answer that question. Everyone wants to turn a blind eye and basically talk about these daily events, about what's going on with Kim and Kanye. Who gives a fuck about Kim and Kanye? Kanye married a hoe. All right? That's what they do. They hoe. They're hoes. Nobody cares about that. You know, I'm tired of hearing about all this BS when we need to be paying attention to the real news. Like, why are these people going to Mars? Why are these people always dropping these containers in the projects or poor black neighborhoods? Like, we need to answer those questions. We need to wake up to those. We need to be privy to what's going on and stop being in our phone looking at mindless videos of guys fighting. Whack 100 fighting two racist guys, which to me look planned. I mean, a lot of this stuff is planned to me. But let's look at what they're doing. They're planning all this stuff in those neighborhoods, and then they're trying to minimize the police assault, saying that, oh, it wasn't just all because of police assaults. It's not all because of it, I agree, but the majority of police are killing black men, especially unarmed black men, at a high rate. And we're not doing nothing about it. And black women and Mexicans and there's Hispanics where I'm at in El Paso where they're being killed by cops. Sometimes they're unarmed. So we have to pay attention that it's not just us, it's other minorities going through this. And we have got to wake up, man. So let me know in the comment section, what do you think the rise in crime is due to? I do think the pandemic has something to do with it, but I think it's mainly them dropping guns and drugs in the projects, and because people are poor, they're going to rob one another, and you're most likely going to be killed by somebody that's close to you or live around you. That's just the facts. Or is it because of just the police, or is it because of the government? Or let me know, what do you feel is the reason the crime is rising? Thank you for listening, and we're out. Deezy.